When the earthquake hit, a former Navy SEAL watched the old market across the street buckle at one corner. Inside, he found a trapped German shepherd, but once freed, the dog kept staring back at the building. Its owner, a structural engineer, had been missing for 11 days. At dawn, the shepherd returned to the market and followed the same exact route. Again and again, the dog stopped where its missing owner had once measured the ground. Now the question wasn't only where the engineer had gone, but what he had been trying to understand before he vanished. Stay with this story to the end, and like and subscribe for more journeys of loyalty and healing. By noon, the heat had turned Main Street in Ashford Mesa into a ribbon of white glare. Ethan Hale was outside Hale Hardware, tightening the last bracket on an awning his sister had insisted was good for one more summer. At 43, Ethan was still built like a man who had spent years training for work that punished wasted motion. Tall, broad-shouldered, lean through the waist, his dark olive t-shirt was already damp across the back. Below him, Leah Hale folded her arms. "If you replace one more thing I didn't ask you to replace, I'm charging you rent." It was pulling out of the brick. It had character. It had gravity. Leah almost smiled. Ethan had returned for the summer to help his 46-year-old sister run the family hardware store. A marine logistics job waited in early fall, and he had no plan to stay. Leah knew that. She also knew his oldest habit. When Ethan saw something failing, he reached for a tool before asking whether anyone wanted it fixed. Across the street stood Bellwether Hall, the nearly century-old market at the center of town. Generations of ordinary business under one faded brick roof. Then the ground moved. The ladder kicked sideways. Ethan was down before Leah finished saying his name. Hale Hardware's windows rattled. Across the street, people stumbled from Bellwether Hall, while a hanging sign swung hard on its chains. A deep vibration came through the pavement, strong enough to make parked cars rock, and a water line split near the curb. The shaking lasted less than half a minute. When it stopped, Bellwether Hall still stood, but its south corner had dropped several inches, and brick covered the sidewalk. The fire department arrived within minutes. Ethan helped Leah move 2 older customers into the shade and carried out water. "Don't organize the county," Leah told him. "I'm carrying water." "You're thinking about organizing the county." Fire Captain Joel Mercer stretched red tape across the street and ordered everyone back. The first sweep suggested the market was empty. Then Ethan heard 3 soft knocks from inside. He turned. 2 more came after a pause. Not falling brick, not loose metal. Something was making a rhythm. Ethan went to the safety line. "Captain," Mercer followed his gaze. "There's something inside. Ground floor, west side." They listened together. A weak scrape came from beyond the entrance. Mercer sent firefighter Luis Ruiz to recheck the western corridor. After a quick assessment, he looked at Ethan. "You can place the sound better than we can. Stay with Ruiz. He says out. You come out." Leah heard. She did not tell Ethan not to go. She only said, "Don't make me explain you to Mom when I'm 90. Their mother had been gone 4 years. The old joke landed exactly where Leah meant it to. Inside Bellwether Hall, dust hung in pale light, while a refrigeration alarm chirped deeper inside. Then came the scrape again. Ethan pointed left. He and Ruiz moved past the sewing shop into a narrow office area. A tall filing cabinet had tipped against a heavy oak table. Something shifted beneath it. Ruiz crouched. 2 amber eyes looked back through the shadow. "A dog," he said. The German shepherd was wedged beneath the table, body low, black and tan coat gray with dust. One ear stood straight, the right tip folded slightly inward. He breathed fast, but showed no obvious injury or frantic thrashing. "Easy," Ethan said. He lowered himself enough to reduce his size, but did not reach in. The shepherd watched him, Ethan's dark hair had fallen forward over his forehead, with sweat and dust, but he resisted the urge to wipe it away. Sudden movement was unnecessary. The dog's black muzzle lifted once, scent first, decision second. Ruiz checked the cabinet. It's pinning the exit, not the dog. Ethan studied the angle. Table's carrying most of it. We moved the bottom 2 inches, no more. Together they shifted the cabinet just enough to open a path. The shepherd did not bolt. For one strange second, he stayed under the table, staring toward the corridor behind Ethan. Then a low creak sounded overhead. Ruiz glanced up. "We're done. Come on." Ethan turned sideways and tapped his thigh once. The dog came. Ethan had not earned trust. There was simply an open route, and the animal was smart enough to take it. They were halfway toward the entrance when the floor trembled beneath them. A small aftershock. Dust sifted down from overhead. Voices rose outside. Ruiz kept moving. Ethan did too. The shepherd stayed close between them until daylight opened ahead. People made room. The dog stopped. Ethan expected him to keep going. Instead, the German shepherd turned toward Bellwether Hall. His gaze moved first to the main entrance, then higher, toward the second-floor windows, then west, toward the corridor they had just left. He did not bark. He did not fight the temporary leash Ruiz had clipped on him. He simply stood there, ears forward, breathing hard, waiting. Ethan crouched beside him. "You got somebody in there?" The dog kept watching the building. Captain Mercer ordered another check of the cleared areas. No person was found. That should have ended the question. It did not end the dog's waiting. Leah came through the crowd carrying 2 bottles of water, one for Ethan, and one she set on the pavement near the dog without trying to push it toward him. "You all right?" she asked. "Yeah." She looked at the shepherd instead. "I meant both of you." Ethan unscrewed the bottle and poured a little water into the paper bowl someone had found. The dog sniffed first, drank only a few mouthfuls, then lifted his head toward Bellwether Hall again. Leah followed his gaze. "He wants back in." "No," Ethan said. "I think he wants somebody to come out." That was different. Leah's expression softened, but only for a moment. Around them, firefighters were still checking names against shop owners and workers. No one was missing from the market's known occupants. Whatever the shepherd expected, nobody in the crowd could explain it. Ethan could have gone back across the street. Hale Hardware had broken merchandise, no power, and a sister who had spent the last hour doing 3 jobs at once. Instead, he stayed until the veterinarian arrived. Leah noticed. She did not tell him to leave. An hour later, Ethan rode in Dr. Camille Hart's veterinary SUV with the German shepherd lying on a blanket between his boots. Camille, 39, had arrived to examine the dog away from dust and noise. "He can walk," Camille said as she drove. "That doesn't mean he needs to." Ethan kept one hand near the dog without touching him. He seemed steady. He was trapped under furniture during an earthquake. "I meant physically." "I know what you meant." The shepherd lifted his head at Camille's voice, then set it down again. At the clinic, the examination brought the first clean answer of the day. No fracture. No serious injury. Mild dehydration. Dust irritation. Stress. Camille listened to his chest a second time, then looked at Ethan. "He got lucky." Ethan glanced at the dog. "No," Camille added. "The table got lucky. He was smart enough to stay under it." She passed a microchip scanner over the shepherd's shoulders. The scanner beeped. Camille read the number on the screen and typed it into the clinic computer. Her expression changed. "What?" She looked at the shepherd again. "His name is Slate." The dog's left ear moved at the word. Ethan tried it. "Slate." Both amber eyes came up. That answer was immediate. Camille turned back to the monitor. "Owner is Oliver Trent." Then she stopped typing. Ethan waited. "You know him?" I know the name. Before Camille could explain, the front bell sounded. A woman in plain clothes entered carrying a small burgundy notebook. Her dark hair was tied low, and a badge rested at her belt. Camille exhaled through her nose. And apparently the police know it better. Detective Elena Park introduced herself without ceremony. She looked first at Slate, then at Ethan. You found him in Bellwether Hall? With the fire crew? Under a desk? Table. Filing cabinet blocked him in. Elena wrote only a few words. Then she said, Oliver Trent has been missing for 11 days. For a moment, Ethan looked through the clinic's front window toward the hazy line of downtown. 11 days was long enough for ordinary explanations to become harder, but not impossible. Cars broke down. Phones disappeared. People left for reasons their families did not understand. Elena did not speculate. Ethan respected her for it. Slate made the only statement anyone in the room could actually verify. At the sound of Oliver's name, his eyes opened. Ethan looked down at him. Missing how? Vehicle unaccounted for. Phone off. No bank activity. Family hasn't heard from him. Elena's tone stayed careful. She was not building a mystery out of things she did not know. Ethan asked the obvious question. The dog disappeared with him? No. That answer changed the room. Elena explained that Slate had been seen repeatedly since Oliver vanished. Around Oliver's house, around Bellwether Hall. A few shop owners had fed him. May Holloway, the 74-year-old woman who ran the sewing shop inside Bellwether Hall, had been leaving water beneath the awning almost every morning. Animal control tried to pick him up twice, Elena said. He kept moving before they could get close. Never aggressive, just wouldn't stay. Camille scratched gently beneath Slate's jaw. And today? A vendor saw him go into Bellwether Hall before the shaking, Elena said. Probably through a service entrance. He'd been doing that off and on. Ethan thought about Slate turning back after the rescue, waiting. For Oliver? Elena closed the notebook. We don't know. That was the correct answer. It still felt incomplete. Before leaving, Elena added one fact that stayed with Ethan. Oliver was a structural engineer. Bellwether Hall was one of the places he'd been working most often before he disappeared. Camille looked at Slate. So he wasn't wandering there by accident. No, Elena said. Probably not. By late afternoon, the earthquake had become a list. Closed buildings, failing refrigeration, tenants calling landlords, owners counting broken glass. Ashford Mesa had entered the long part of a disaster, the part without sirens, North Star renewal. Partners arrived with bottled water, portable generators, folding shade canopies, and an offer to help displaced merchants set up temporary stalls near the fairgrounds. Their development project, Mesa Vista District, had already been changing the east side of town for months. Richard Sloan, North Star's development director, came to Hale Hardware shortly before sunset. He was 51, clean-shaven, composed despite the heat, in a pale gray polo and dark trousers. I'm sorry about today, Richard told Leah. We have crews and equipment nearby. If there's anything practical North Star can do, call me directly. He handed her a card. Leah accepted it. Generators are practical. We have 3 being delivered. Ethan stood behind the counter repairing a battery lantern. Richard glanced at him. You're Ethan. Not a question. Ashford Mesa still remembers people who leave, Richard said with an easy smile. Ethan looked up. Apparently. Richard's smile held. Then he left for the diner next door. Leah watched him go. Don't. I didn't say anything. You have a face for saying things without paperwork. Ethan went back to the lantern. At 7, County Building official Grant Mercer held a briefing behind city offices. His message was cautious. Bellwether Hall remained closed pending inspection. Some nearby buildings needed checks. No long-term evacuation order had been issued. Then Leah unfolded a printed map someone from a business association had emailed her. A thick red line enclosed Bellwether Hall. It also enclosed Hale Hardware, the diner, an apartment row, several houses beyond them. Ethan studied it. Those houses barely moved. Grant adjusted his reading glasses. This isn't the county's map. Whose is it? Leah asked. Grant pointed to the small mark in the lower corner. North Star Renewal Partners. A technical proposal, Grant said. They submitted it this afternoon as a possible long-term safety perimeter while conditions are evaluated. County hasn't accepted it. Ethan looked again at the red line. If adopted, it would remove much of the old commercial district from normal use for an unknown length of time. Leah folded the map once. Everyone helps fast around here. Her voice was dry. Leah studied the same line, then looked at Ethan rather than the map. "This is a proposal," she said. "I heard him. That means don't start a war before breakfast. I'm not starting anything." You get that look when you've decided there's a right answer before everyone else has finished reading the question. Ethan almost argued. Then he stopped. The map was not an order. Grant had been clear about that. No one had told Leah she had to close Hale Hardware for months. No one had proved why the red line needed to reach as far as it did. Not yet. So Ethan folded his impatience back with the paper and carried both home. He looked at Bellwether Hall across the darkening street. By midnight, Slate was sleeping on a blanket beside Leah's front door. Camille had agreed that a quiet house was better than holding him overnight at the clinic, and Elena had approved Ethan and Leah as temporary caretakers until Oliver's family could be contacted. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with the red zone map folded beside his black watch. He had been back in Ashford Mesa less than 3 weeks. He had planned to repair shelves, help Leah through the summer rush, and leave before September. Now a German shepherd belonging to a missing engineer was asleep 10 feet away. Across town, a building that had stood nearly 100 years was dark behind safety tape, and a company developing the largest project Ashford Mesa had seen in decades had already drawn a line around half the neighborhood. An engine passed outside. Slate's head came up instantly. The dog did not bark. He stood, walked to the glass beside the front door, and stared into the street. Ethan joined him. A white survey truck rolled through the intersection under the yellow streetlights. North Star's logo was visible on the door. Slate watched until the taillights disappeared. Maybe he recognized the vehicle or its sound. Maybe he only disliked trucks after the day he had survived. Ethan refused to make certainty out of an animal's attention, but he stayed beside Slate after the street was empty. The earthquake was over. What it had exposed was not. Slate did not like the dog bed. Camille Hart had sent it home with Ethan anyway, along with medication, feeding instructions, and a warning not to mistake quiet behavior for comfort. The bed was thick, washable, and probably more expensive than anything Ethan had ever bought for a dog. Leah placed it in the corner of her living room, where the air conditioning reached without blowing directly across it. Slate sniffed the bed once, then he walked past it and lay on the floor between the hallway and the front door. Leah looked at Ethan. "That feels familiar." Ethan was standing at the kitchen counter with a wrench in his hand, tightening the handle on a cabinet drawer that had survived the earthquake but apparently not his inspection. "I sleep in beds. You also notice every door in every room before you sit down. That is not the same thing." Slate lifted his head as if considering the argument, then lowered it again. It had been less than 24 hours since Ethan and firefighter Luis Ruiz had pulled the 6-year-old German shepherd from beneath the table inside Bellwether Hall. Camille had confirmed that Slate had escaped with nothing worse than dehydration, dust irritation, and stress. Oliver Trent had not been so easy to locate. The structural engineer had been missing for 11 days. His car was still unaccounted for. His phone remained off. No fresh bank activity had appeared. Detective Elena Park had made no promises to Ethan about what those facts meant, and Ethan had appreciated that. The only thing certain was that Slate belonged to Oliver. And Slate was now sleeping on Leah's floor. Animal Control had offered to hold him temporarily, while Oliver's family arranged travel from another state. The plan lasted until an officer opened the rear doors of the transport van. Slate had gone rigid. He had not growled. He had not snapped. He simply planted all 4 feet and backed away until the leash tightened. Camille tried coaxing him. The officer tried food. Slate refused both. Then Ethan opened the passenger door of his old pickup. Slate looked at him, looked at the truck, and climbed in without being asked twice. Elena watched from the clinic parking lot. "You understand this is temporary," she had said. "That was my understanding. Feed him what Camille says. Keep him available if I need him brought in. Don't decide you're his new owner." Ethan glanced at Slate sitting stiffly on the truck's back bench. "I'm not in the market for a dog." Elena had closed her notebook. Dogs rarely check the market. Now, in Leah's house, Slate slept lightly. He did not chew furniture. He did not beg at the table. He did not seek affection unless Ethan or Leah came close first. When Leah sat on the floor that evening and offered an open hand, Slate sniffed her fingers, allowed one slow stroke beneath the jaw, then moved back to his place near the door. At 11, Ethan found him there. At 1 in the morning, Slate was still there. At 6:20 the next day, he was standing. Not pacing, not whining. Standing beside the front door, watching Ethan. Ethan pulled on his boots. Outside? Slate's ears lifted. Ethan clipped on the temporary leash. The instant the door opened, Slate stepped into the warm morning and turned toward downtown. Ethan stopped. The dog stopped too. "Yard first." Slate looked back at him. There was no reason a German Shepherd should be able to look skeptical, but Slate managed it. Ethan guided him toward the patch of dry grass beside the driveway. Slate took care of what he needed to, drank from the bowl Ethan carried, and immediately turned toward the street again. Downtown. No. Slate did not pull hard. He simply leaned into the direction he wanted. Ethan had handled men who reacted badly to orders, equipment that failed under load, and shipping schedules designed by people who seemed personally offended by time. He knew stubbornness when he met it. "You are recovering." Slate sat down. That somehow felt worse. Ethan stared at him. Slate stared back. Finally, Ethan pointed toward the house. "Tomorrow." Slate stood, walked inside, and returned to the floor by the door. The next morning at 6:20, the same thing happened. By the third morning, Ethan had stopped pretending it was random. Leah came into the kitchen wearing a faded sage work shirt and carrying coffee. "You're going, aren't you?" Ethan clipped on Slate's leash. "I'm walking a dog." At exactly the time the dog requested. "I'm gathering information." "Of course you are." She took a sip. Ethan opened the door. Leah called after him. "Try not to annex anything." Ashford Mesa before 7 in the morning was a different town from the one that sweated through the afternoon. Delivery trucks idled behind shops. Sprinklers clicked over narrow lawns. The air already carried heat, but it had not yet turned heavy enough to flatten conversation. Slate walked with purpose. Not fast. Not searching the way a scent hound might search. He simply knew where he wanted to go. At the first intersection, he turned west. Ethan led him. Bellwether Hall stood 2 blocks ahead behind county barriers and red safety tape. In the early light, the damage looked both less dramatic and more permanent. The building was still there. That almost made the lowered south corner easier to overlook. Slate did not go to the main entrance. He turned down the western side street, then into the service alley. Ethan shortened the leash near the safety perimeter, but did not pull him away. Slate stopped beside a metal utility box fixed to the wall of an adjoining shop. He sniffed near the base, waited, then moved on. At the south edge of Bellwether Hall, he stopped again near a narrow strip of pavement between the building and a chain-link barrier. He looked up at the wall. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing obvious. Then Slate moved to an old streetlight at the corner and paused there too. 3 places. No digging, no scratching, no dramatic behavior. Only pauses. Slate continued around the block, crossed back toward the west side, and finished near the service entrance, where May Holloway was setting a folding chair beneath a temporary shade canopy. May was 74, small and straight-backed, with silver-white hair cut into a short bob. Her sewing shop inside Bellwether Hall was closed with everything else, but she had already claimed 6 feet of sidewalk outside the safety perimeter and arranged 2 plastic bins beside her chair. She saw Slate first. "Well, there you are." Slate's pace changed immediately. Not excitement, recognition. May crouched slowly and held out her hand. Slate went to her without hesitation and pressed his muzzle against her palm. Ethan noticed. May noticed Ethan noticing. "He knows me," she said. "So I gathered. I've been giving him water since Oliver disappeared." She scratched gently beneath Slate's left ear. Then she looked toward the route Ethan had just followed. "You took his morning round." Ethan glanced back. "His." "Oliver's." May straightened. "That's the route Oliver Trent walked most mornings. Slate went with him." The answer was simple enough that Ethan felt almost foolish for having expected something more complicated. Slate had not been leading him somewhere new. He had been returning to something old. May tapped one of the plastic bins with the toe of her shoe. "Oliver liked to work before the heat got mean. He'd come through around 6:15, 6:30. Stop at the west wall, south corner, light pole. Sometimes another place near the alley. Slate would follow, then they'd go home." "What was Oliver checking?" May shrugged. "He used words I pretended to understand." "That makes 2 of us." May smiled. "Something about movement." Ethan looked at Bellwether Hall again. Slate had settled beside May's chair. For the first time since the rescue, the dog looked less like he was waiting for an emergency to finish. He looked like he had reached a place where part of his day made sense. That changed Ethan's question. He had been wondering why Slate kept returning to Bellwether Hall. Now he had an answer. Routine. The deeper question was what Oliver had been doing there often enough for the route to become Slate's routine, too. Later that morning, Ethan found Grant Mercer outside the temporary county inspection trailer. Grant was reviewing photographs on a tablet, while 2 engineers spoke near Bellwether Hall. Ethan pointed toward the west wall. "Oliver put monitoring equipment around the building?" Grant looked up. "What did you find?" "Slate stopped in the same places Oliver used to stop. May said Oliver checked them every morning." Grant followed Ethan toward the corner. At the utility box, Grant crouched and pointed to a small rectangular device mounted near the masonry joint. "Crack gauge." The plastic was dusty and easy to miss, unless someone knew what to look for. At the south side, they found another marker. Near the streetlight, a small tilt sensor sat fixed low against a support base. Ethan studied each one. "These Olivers?" "Part of a temporary monitoring program." Grant stood and wiped dust from his fingers. Oliver was hired as an independent consultant when Mesa Vista started deeper excavation. Ethan looked past Bellwether Hall. 2 blocks east, cranes and fencing marked North Star's development site. For the parking garage? Mostly. Grant explained it without drama. Mesa Vista required a deep underground excavation. To keep the pit dry, pumps removed groundwater as crews worked below grade. "Dewatering," Grant said. "Normal construction method. But anytime you change water conditions below ground, you monitor nearby structures, old buildings especially." Oliver thought there was a problem. He thought it needed close watching. That was not the same answer. Ethan waited. Grant recognized the silence. He never said the project was automatically unsafe. He did warn that excavation and groundwater changes could affect nearby soil if the system wasn't controlled correctly. So Bellwether Hall wasn't just being monitored because it was old. No building is ever just one thing. Grant looked at the lowered south corner. It's old. It has weaknesses. There's a major excavation nearby. Then an earthquake hits. Anyone giving you a simple answer this early is selling something. That line stayed with Ethan. By lunchtime, plenty of people were selling things. North Star's temporary business site opened near the county fairgrounds under large white shade tents. The company provided power hookups, fans, folding tables, drinking water, and refrigerated storage. Ethan helped Leah move hardware bins into a temporary stall, while customers, shop owners, and volunteers argued over extension cords. The scene did not fit neatly into good people and bad people. North Star's generators worked. Their bottled water was cold. A woman from the bakery hugged one of their site coordinators because the company had found freezer space for several $1,000s worth of inventory. 2 stalls away, a landlord complained that North Star had been asking about buying his building for 6 months. May Holloway sat behind a folding table covered in fabric samples. A North Star representative handed her an envelope. Ethan watched. May opened it. Read. Folded it again. No outrage. No indignation. She put it into her purse. Later, Ethan carried a box of thread over to her table. What did they offer? May looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. You always ask women about their finances before lunch? Only the terrifying ones. That's better. She adjusted a row of fabric bundles. They offered enough. To sell? To think. Ethan frowned before he could stop himself. May saw that too. There it is. What? That expression people get when an old woman fails to behave nostalgically. I didn't say anything. You and your sister share that excuse. May pointed toward Bellwether Hall, visible beyond the fairgrounds in the distance. I opened my shop there 38 years ago. My husband helped paint the first sign. My daughter did homework under the cutting table. I loved that place before half this town knew what love cost. She paused. Then her voice stayed matter-of-fact. My daughter wants me closer to her. My knees hurt. The air conditioning in my shop is older than some marriages. North Star gives me the right number. I might take it. Ethan leaned one hand against the table. I thought you wanted Bellwether Hall saved. I want people to tell me the truth about whether it can be saved. May held his gaze. That is not the same thing as promising to spend the rest of my life opening its door. Then she gave him the line that followed him all afternoon. You're 30 years younger than me. You can call it history. I call it the shop I have to unlock every morning. Ethan went back to Hale Hardware's temporary stall with less certainty than he had left it. That evening, Leah found an envelope of her own. They were behind the closed hardware store, sorting earthquake damage under battery lights. Leah stood by the workbench with North Star's offer in one hand. Ethan read the number. It was good. Very good. Enough to clear the remaining business loan, pay for the roof Hale Hardware needed, and still leave Leah money to begin somewhere else if she wanted. You're not signing this. The words were out before Ethan had finished reading the second page. Leah's face changed. Not surprise. Recognition. You want to try that again? Ethan put the paper down. They hand you a red zone map one day, and a purchase offer the next. That doesn't bother you? It bothers me. Then why are we talking about it? Because it is my store. Our family's store. My loan. That stopped him. Leah took the pages back. Do you know how many months we barely covered payroll last winter? Ethan said nothing. How much the roof estimate was? He knew roughly. Not enough. Leah folded the offer. You came back for the summer. I'm glad you did. I mean that. But you don't get to arrive in July and decide what my October looks like. Ethan felt his first instinct rise. Explain. Make the case. List the reasons. The same instinct that made him tighten hinges no one had asked him to inspect. He tried a different question. You want to sell? Leah looked toward the dark storefront. I don't know. That answer was harder to argue with. She slipped the offer into her bag. Ethan asked, How long do you have? 2 weeks. He nodded. Leah studied him for a second. You're leaving at the end of summer, right? That's the plan. Then don't decide my life for the fall. She walked inside. Ethan remained by the workbench. Slate was lying nearby on the cool concrete. At some point during the argument, the dog had moved from beside Ethan to the open doorway closer to Leah, not choosing sides, just repositioning toward the person whose voice had tightened most. Ethan noticed anyway. You too? Slate rested his muzzle on his paws. The next morning, Elena Park called before Ethan and Slate reached the end of their route. She asked him to meet her at Grant's office. When Ethan arrived, Elena had a printed report spread across the conference table. Oliver Trent's signature sat on the final page. This is the last structural recommendation we have from him, Elena said. Ethan read the highlighted paragraph. Oliver had recommended closure of hazardous areas at Bellwether Hall until further evaluation. The language was plain. North Star had already quoted it publicly. So he did think the building needed closing. Part of it. Elena turned back several pages. Near the bottom of one section was a sentence Ethan would have skipped if she had not marked it. Recommendation applies to South Structural Zone only. See Appendix C. Ethan looked at the packet. Where's Appendix C? Grant answered from the other side of the table. We're trying to determine that. The report had not been torn apart. The page numbers ran normally. The packet itself looked complete. Grant had checked the digital records. Oliver originally submitted 6 electronic files. Only 5 were now attached to the archived city packet. No one knew yet whether the missing 6th file had been removed deliberately, lost during migration, or stored elsewhere. Elena made that distinction immediately. We have no evidence someone deleted it intentionally. Ethan nodded. No forged signature. No altered language we can establish. Grant tapped the line again. But without Appendix C, nobody reading the public packet knows exactly how Oliver defined the South Structural Zone, or what conditions he attached to this recommendation. That changed the meaning without changing a single written word. Ethan thought about the red line North Star had circulated, about Richard Sloane saying even Oliver had questioned Bellwether Hall, about May considering a sale, about Leah's offer sitting in her bag. The problem was no longer whether Oliver had warned that Bellwether Hall was unsafe. He had. The problem was what, exactly, he had meant. Elena gathered the pages. For now, this is a records issue, nothing more. Ethan looked toward the window. Outside, Slate was lying in the strip of shade beside the county office, his body angled toward downtown. At 6:20 tomorrow, Ethan knew where the dog would want to go. The same west wall, the same south corner, the same street light. A route repeated often enough that Slate still followed it without the man who had taught it to him. Ethan had started the week thinking the dog was looking for Oliver. Maybe Slate was. But Slate was also preserving something else without knowing it. A schedule, a habit, a map of where Oliver had chosen to pay attention. And somewhere between those quiet stopping points and a missing appendix, Ethan was beginning to understand that Bellwether Hall had not suddenly become complicated when the earth moved. It had been complicated already. The first independent engineers arrived before sunrise because no one wanted to spend more time than necessary inside a fenced-off work zone after the temperature crossed 100 degrees. By 7, Bellwether Hall was surrounded by equipment that looked almost disappointingly ordinary. Tripods, levels, small drilling rigs, plastic cases full of sensors, orange extension cords, 2 folding tables shaded by a county canopy. Ethan stood outside the barrier with Slate at his left side and watched a woman in a white hard hat press a measuring device against the south wall. Nothing about the scene looked dramatic enough to settle an argument that had divided half of Ashford Mesa. That was probably a good sign. Grant Mercer had insisted on bringing in structural and geotechnical engineers with no financial connection to North Star Renewal Partners, the business association, or the owners of Bellwether Hall. The building doesn't care who wins the argument, Grant had told the county board. Gravity has no local politics. Now the first results were beginning to come in. They were not what Ethan wanted. 3 structural points along the southern section of Bellwether Hall had weakened beyond what the county could ignore. A stretch of foundation required stabilization. The exterior stairs on the south side would remain closed. Part of the roof framing had shifted enough during the earthquake that reopening the entire market without repairs would be irresponsible. Grant gave Ethan the summary outside the inspection trailer late that morning. So, the red line was right? No. Grant removed his hard hat and wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. Don't turn one answer into another question before I finish. Ethan leaned against the railing. Grant had learned quickly that Ethan's silence could be more impatient than most people's interruptions. Bellwether Hall has real damage, Grant continued. Some of it predates the earthquake. Some of it was made worse by the shaking. Southside needs significant work. Could it collapse? Not the whole building while we're standing here having this conversation, but I'm not opening that section to the public. Ethan looked across the street at the old market. For the last several days, it had been easy to think of Bellwether Hall as something being threatened by other people. North Star, developers, maps, purchase offers. Now the building itself was part of the problem. Grant followed his gaze. Oliver never wrote that the place was perfectly safe. I know. Do you? There was no accusation in Grant's voice. That made the question harder. Ethan had read Oliver Trent's report. He had seen the line limiting the closure recommendation to the South Structural Zone. He had also seen the sentence before it. Hazardous conditions existed. Those words were real, too. If a section of Bellwether Hall had to come down, then saving the building could not mean pretending otherwise. Ethan had spent much of his adult life in jobs where people got into trouble by deciding the answer first and forcing facts to fit around it. He had no intention of doing the civilian version of the same thing just because Hale Hardware sat inside somebody else's proposed red line. So we close what needs closing, Ethan said. Grant nodded. And we prove what doesn't. That was the first useful thing Ethan had heard all morning. Slate shifted beside him. The shepherd had become stronger over the past few days. His coat had lost most of the gray dust from Bellwether Hall, and his movement was no longer careful from exhaustion. His routine had not changed. At 6:20 every morning, Slate still stood beside Leah's front door. Ethan had stopped pretending to negotiate. They walked. West wall, service alley, south edge, streetlight, utility box, back around. Slate did not hurry through the route, and he did not behave as if he expected to uncover anything. He simply revisited the places Oliver had revisited. That morning, however, something new happened. An engineer named Denise Rowland, part of the independent monitoring team, was replacing a temporary displacement sensor near the south corner. Ethan and Slate waited outside her workspace. Denise connected a handheld reader. The device gave a short electronic beep. Slate sat. Immediately, no hesitation. His hindquarters touched the pavement, and his eyes went to Denise's hand. Denise looked down. Well, hello to you too. Slate remained seated. A produce vendor setting up across the street laughed. That's Trent's biscuit alarm. Ethan turned. The man wiped his hands on his apron. Oliver always had treats in his field bag. Machine beeped, dog sat, biscuit appeared, like clockwork. Denise looked at Ethan. You didn't know? No. She pressed a button on the reader. The device beeped again. Slate's ears lifted, still seated, waiting. Ethan almost smiled. There goes the mystery. Slate glanced at him, unimpressed by the lack of payment. Ethan reached into the small pouch Camille had given him and handed over a biscuit. Slate took it with grave satisfaction. Then Ethan looked at the old crack gauge mounted farther down the wall. A question came to him for a practical reason, not an investigative one. If Oliver checked these every day, did all the readings go somewhere central? Denise shook her head. Depends on the instrument. Some transmit. Some log internally. Some are manual only. What about these? She followed his finger. Older units. I'd have to check the model. Grant was passing behind them and stopped. You thinking the central records might not be the only records? I'm asking if the instruments remember. Denise crouched beside the old device. Some do. That afternoon, with the county's permission, the independent team began checking the remaining monitoring equipment Oliver had installed or overseen. Most of it gave them nothing useful. One device had lost power. Another stored only recent snapshots. A third required a manufacturer tool before anything could be recovered. But 2 units still held partial local records. Not a perfect timeline. Not proof of wrongdoing. Enough to change the conversation. The south side of Bellwether Hall had been moving, very slightly, before the earthquake. Millimeters. Small enough that a person walking past the building would never notice. Large enough for engineers to care. Denise laid the recovered readings beside the construction schedule for Mesa Vista. The dates did not match perfectly. Reality almost never did. But there were periods when the rate of movement increased during heavier dewatering at the Mesa Vista excavation. Ethan looked at the chart. So, North Star caused it. Denise did not answer. Grant did. No. Ethan looked at him. Grant pointed at the numbers. This is correlation. It earns another question. It doesn't answer the question. Denise nodded. The building is old. Soil changes seasonally. Groundwater moves. Nearby excavation can matter. The earthquake matters. We need broader data before anyone says what caused what. Ethan felt the familiar urge to push. Then he remembered Leah standing behind the workbench with North Star's offer in her hand. You don't get to arrive in July and decide what my October looks like. He looked at the chart again. All right. Grant seemed mildly surprised. That's it? What would you prefer? I was prepared for resistance. Enjoy the disappointment. Grant smiled once. The county expanded the review, not the evacuation zone, the investigation. Engineers began looking at groundwater records, the Mesa Vista excavation, the temporary pumping system, and several old observation wells around Ashford Mesa. The distinction mattered. No new accusation had been proven. But Bellwether Hall could no longer be explained simply as an old building that happened to meet an earthquake on a bad day. Something had been happening before the ground shook. At the temporary market, the earthquake was becoming less about geology and more about refrigerator space. By mid-afternoon, the temperature beneath the white tents had climbed above 100. A portable generator serving 3 food stalls shut down with a sharp cough. Within seconds, everyone within 20 feet had an opinion. The butcher wanted priority because he had meat. The bakery wanted priority because butter was turning soft. The woman selling prepared meals pointed out that her entire business depended on keeping food below safe temperature. Leah arrived carrying 2 extension reels from Hale Hardware's temporary stall. Everyone stopped plugging things into the same circuit. A man beside the generator lifted both hands. I didn't. You're standing on your cord. He looked down. He was. Ethan helped redistribute the load, while Leah reorganized the outlets with the authority of someone who had spent 20 years explaining electricity to customers, who believed adapters could negotiate with physics. Slate stayed beneath the shade of a table beside May Holloway. May had placed a metal water bowl there. She had also placed a handwritten sign beside it. For Slate. Humans ask first. The dog had become one of the few things in the temporary market nobody argued about. The people did plenty of arguing around him. A man from the apartment row accused property owners considering Northstar offers of selling out the neighborhood. Another owner answered that sentimental speeches did not pay mortgages. The exchange grew sharp enough that several customers began pretending not to listen. May looked up from the pair of pants she was hemming by hand. That's enough. The two men stopped, mostly because May sounded like she had spent 74 years preparing to say exactly those words. One of them pointed toward the distant Bellwether Hall. If everybody sells, there won't be anything left. May threaded her needle. If everybody stays because you shame them, there won't be much worth saving either. The man frowned. We're talking about community. So am I. May looked around the tent. Some of us want to stay. Some of us are tired. Some of us need the money. Some have children who left and want us closer. Don't turn loving this place into an order that everybody has to die here. The market went quiet for half a second. Then a freezer alarm started beeping, and practical life resumed. Ethan stood beside Leah with a coil of cable in his hands. May's words did not feel aimed at him. That made them more effective. Later, Leah handed him a cold bottle of water. They had not discussed Northstar's offer since their argument. Ethan had thought of half a dozen ways to reopen the subject. For once, he used none of them. Leah noticed. You feeling well? Probably heat stroke. That would explain the silence. He twisted the cap off the bottle. Offer still good? Leah looked toward her temporary hardware stall. Yes. You decided anything? No. Ethan nodded. Leah waited for the rest. There was no rest. Her expression softened by a degree. Thank you. He knew what she meant. That bothered him more than if she had criticized him. Before Ethan could answer, Elena Park appeared at the edge of the market and motioned toward him. She was not there for lunch. An hour later, Ethan sat in a small conference room behind the county planning office with Elena and a woman he had not met before. Megan Pierce was 31, a geotechnical field technician employed by Northstar Renewal Partners. She had arrived without a company truck, without a hard hat, without the teal insulated bottle clipped to the side of the field pack. Ethan later learned she carried almost everywhere. Instead, she wore a pale blue-gray blouse, olive trousers, and the tense expression of someone who had spent the drive over, considering several places to turn around. Elena had already made the boundaries clear before Ethan entered. Megan was speaking voluntarily. No promises had been made. Nothing she said automatically became proof, simply because it sounded troubling. Ethan took the chair farthest from her. Megan noticed Slate outside the glass door. He's Oliver's dog. Yes. Her eyes stayed on him for another moment. I wondered what happened to him. Ethan wanted to ask what she knew about Oliver. Elena did it first. You said Dr. Trent argued with Northstar's geotechnical team. Megan shook her head. He's not a doctor. Just Oliver. He hated when contractors added titles to make meetings sound expensive. The smallest trace of a smile appeared and disappeared. That told Ethan more about their relationship than a paragraph of explanation would have. Megan continued. Oliver had not accused Northstar of falsifying field readings. That mattered enough for her to repeat it. No one changed the numbers I saw. Elena wrote that down. Then what concerned you? Megan folded her hands. How we used them. She explained carefully. Groundwater modeling depended on assumptions. where the boundaries were drawn, which monitoring wells were included, how long a time period was examined, which soil layer was emphasized. Professional judgment was unavoidable. So was uncertainty. If we modeled a broader area, Megan said, the change around Mesa Vista stood out more clearly against the surrounding groundwater conditions. And a smaller area? Elena asked. More noise? More uncertainty? Easier to say several factors could explain the same movement. Ethan understood enough to dislike the sentence. Which model was used with the city? Megan looked at Elena, not him. The narrower one. Was that technically invalid? Megan took too long to answer. No. That was the problem. It was not a forged number. Not a fake signature. Not somebody writing a lie in red ink. It was a choice among defensible ways of looking at the same ground. Ethan asked, which one did Oliver think was more honest? Megan's jaw tightened. The broader one. And North Star? Elena said I could explain what I saw. I'm not here to assign motives. Elena gave Ethan a look that told him not to push. He pushed anyway, just not in the direction he had intended. Then explain what you saw. Megan did. Internal meetings used one set of comparisons. Public presentations emphasized another. Oliver repeatedly argued that the broader context should be shown alongside the narrower model, so decision-makers could understand the uncertainty. He did not claim the Mesa Vista excavation had conclusively damaged Bellwether Hall. He claimed they were presenting the uncertainty in one direction, the direction that made stopping work less likely. Megan had been in those meetings. She had said nothing. When Ethan asked why, she looked at him for the first time without hesitation. My mother has rheumatoid arthritis. The answer seemed unrelated until she continued. She lost her job last year. She's on my insurance now. Medication, specialists, physical therapy. If I lose North Star, I lose the plan. Ethan leaned back. Megan rubbed one thumb against the other. I kept telling myself I wasn't the engineer signing anything. I was a technician. I collected readings, built tables, ran models people asked me to run. Her eyes dropped briefly. That's a comfortable distinction until somebody disappears. Ethan's first instinct was immediate. Then make it public. Megan's face closed. Elena interrupted before the silence could harden. No. Ethan turned toward her. If she knows the city got a selective picture, she decides what she's ready to say, and when. We document what she can support. We verify it. We don't use her life like another piece of equipment. I'm not using her. Elena's eyes remained calm. You don't carry the consequence if she loses her job tomorrow. The sentence landed cleanly. Ethan thought of Leah, her store, her loan, her October. He looked at Megan again and saw not a reluctant witness blocking a useful answer, but a woman whose risk would continue after everyone else left the meeting. His voice changed. What can you safely give Elena now? Megan noticed the change. So did Elena. A timeline, Megan said. Which meetings Oliver attended, which models were discussed, who had access. That's enough for today, Elena said. Megan breathed out slowly. When the meeting ended, she remained seated. Then she took out her phone. There's one more thing. Elena stopped writing. Megan opened an old message thread. The last time Oliver contacted me, he wasn't asking about Bellwether Hall. She turned the phone so Elena could see. A photograph showed a map of the Ashford Mesa area, with one point circled well outside town. Below it was a short message from Oliver. If this reading is right, Bellwether isn't the center of it. Ethan stared at the circled location. It lay almost 6 miles away. Grant was called in before Megan left. He looked at the map and recognized the site. Old groundwater observation well. Ethan frowned. 6 miles away? Grant understood what he was thinking. No, Stop there." He pointed first to Bellwether Hall, then to the distant mark. Oliver was not saying Mesa Vista moved the ground for 6 miles. Then why monitor out there? Reference point. Grant pulled a county water map from a cabinet. If you want to know whether changes near a construction site are local or part of a broader regional pattern, you compare them against places outside the likely area of influence. He tapped the distant well. If this stays relatively stable, while readings around Mesa Vista shift, that tells you something different from every well across the region changing together. So Oliver was looking for a baseline. Exactly. The explanation reduced the scale of the mystery while increasing its precision. Oliver had not been chasing some giant underground failure beneath Ashford Mesa. He had been trying to determine whether what he saw near Bellwether Hall belonged to the region or to the neighborhood. Elena asked Grant who maintained the observation well. County owns it. Access is shared with contractors doing groundwater work. North Star? Yes. Grant checked the maintenance records on his tablet. Several names appeared. One appeared more than the others. Caleb Stroud, North Star's 52-year-old site superintendent. Elena opened her notebook again. Megan looked at the name and said nothing. Elena asked one final question. Did Oliver know Stroud personally? Megan nodded. They worked together in the field. Elena checked Oliver's phone records. She had already reviewed hundreds of calls. Now one number mattered differently. Oliver Trent had called Caleb Stroud on the night he disappeared. The call lasted 4 minutes and 12 seconds. Ethan looked through the conference room glass. Slate was lying outside the door, chin between his front paws. The shepherd knew nothing about groundwater models, city packets, missing appendices, or competing interpretations of soil movement. He knew a simpler system. Walk the route. Stop at the familiar places. Wait for the machine. When it beeped, sit. That small habit had helped turn attention from a damaged building toward the work Oliver had been trying to finish. Bellwether Hall was still unsafe in places. North Star had still not been proven responsible for that damage. Leah still had every right to sell Hale Hardware if she chose. All of those things could be true at once. And now, one more thing was true. Before Oliver Trent vanished, he had stopped looking only at Bellwether Hall. Then, on the last night anyone could account for him, he had called a man with access to the distant well he was using to understand why. Elena closed her notebook. We talked to Caleb next. This time, Ethan did not tell her how. He only nodded. By Thursday evening, Ashford Mesa had learned how quickly a disaster could become an argument about the future. North Star Renewal Partners rented the high school auditorium because the usual town meeting room was too small. By 6:30, every folding chair was taken. Older shop owners sat beside construction workers, still wearing dust on their boots. Young couples stood along the walls. Retirees fanned themselves with printed handouts. The air conditioning fought a losing battle against 200 people and a July evening that refused to cool. Ethan sat beside Leah halfway down the room. Slate lay beneath Leah's chair, body stretched along the tile where the floor was coolest. The shepherd had become better at tolerating crowds, though he preferred to watch them from low places. His amber eyes followed moving shoes, children, swinging bags, and every person who passed, close enough to matter. On stage, Richard Sloan stood beside a large rendering of Mesa Vista District. He did not look like a man trying to destroy a town. That was what made the meeting useful. Richard spoke without raising his voice. The development, he said, could bring new housing, a hotel, a full-size grocery store, improved water lines, road upgrades, and hundreds of construction jobs over several years. The screen behind him showed tree-lined sidewalks, balconies, shaded courtyards, and families eating outside beneath clean new awnings. Ashford Mesa looked prosperous in the rendering. It also looked younger. Richard did not say Bellwether Hall was worthless. He called it an important part of the town's history. He did not call the surrounding neighborhood obsolete. He called it an area facing difficult infrastructure choices. Even Ethan had to admit that Richard understood language. Then a construction worker in the fourth row stood. The man looked to be in his late 40s, with a sunburned neck and a reflective stripe still visible on his work pants. "My father grew up here," he said. "So did I. I'm not against Bellwether Hall. But my son's 22. He's talking about moving to Phoenix because there's nothing here that pays enough." The room quieted. The man pointed toward the Mesa Vista rendering. "You all want to save every old brick in town. My son wants a job so he doesn't have to leave the state." There was no easy answer. That bothered Ethan more than Richard's polished presentation. For days, the problem had been gaining shape. Bellwether Hall had real structural damage. The proposed red zone was wider than the county had approved. Monitoring data suggested the building had been moving before the earthquake. Oliver Trent's full recommendation remained incomplete because Appendix C was still missing from the archived packet. And Megan Pierce had described how groundwater models could tell different stories without changing a single number. None of that made housing unnecessary. None of it made construction jobs imaginary. Leah leaned toward Ethan. "He's not wrong." Ethan kept his eyes on the stage. "No." Leah glanced at him, perhaps checking whether that single word had physically hurt. Richard moved into questions. A retired teacher asked about traffic. A renter asked how many apartments would actually be affordable. A young mother wanted to know whether the grocery store was guaranteed or merely proposed. Richard answered some questions directly. Others, he answered the way experienced people answered questions they could not control. Carefully enough that nobody could quote a lie later. Slate shifted beneath the chair. Leah dropped one hand and rested it briefly against his shoulder. The dog settled. By the time the meeting ended, Ashford Mesa had not chosen a future. It had simply admitted there were at least two. Outside, the school parking lot held the heat like an oven. People gathered in small circles beneath the lights, continuing arguments the auditorium had not resolved. Ethan and Leah walked toward her truck. Slate moved between them. Leah unlocked the passenger door, but did not open it. "There's something I should have told you." Ethan waited. She looked across the parking lot instead of at him. "I was thinking about selling before the earthquake." For a second, Ethan assumed she meant Northstar's recent offer. Then the words settled correctly. "Before?" "Since February." The answer hit harder than he expected. He leaned one forearm on the truck roof. "Why didn't you tell me?" Leah laughed once without humor. "You were in Baltimore working a port contract." "You could have called." "And said what? Come home because the roof leaks and January sales were terrible?" "Yes. That is exactly why I didn't." Ethan straightened. Leah's face had the tired patience of somebody discovering the same argument wearing a new shirt. "The store has been slowing down for years," she said. "Not dying. Slowing. There's a difference." She counted the problems without drama. The roof needed replacement. The loan from the renovation 5 years earlier still had 4 years left. Online sales had taken part of the business. The town's younger families drove to larger stores more often than they used to. Hale Hardware still made money. It simply demanded more from Leah every year to make less of it. Ethan listened, then ruined the progress. "So we fixed the roof, restructure the loan, expand contractor accounts." Leah closed her eyes. Ethan stopped. Too late. "There," she said. He knew what she meant. "I'm trying to help." "No. You're trying to solve. What's the difference?" "The person who has to live with the answer." Slate stopped beside Leah. The dog looked up at her, then moved closer until his shoulder touched her leg. Ethan noticed, but said nothing. Leah rubbed one hand over Slate's neck. "Dad loved that store," Ethan said. So do I. Then why sell it? Leia finally looked at him. Because loving something and wanting to do it until I'm 70 are not the same thing. The parking lot sound seemed to move farther away. Their father had opened Hale Hardware when Ethan was 9. In Ethan's memory, the store had always been sturdy. Pegboard walls, coffee behind the counter. Their father explaining screws to customers, as if civilization depended on correct thread pitch. Leah had been the one who stayed when their father got sick. She had been the one who learned the books, the payroll, the suppliers, the insurance. Ethan had come home when he could. He had helped. But helping and carrying were not the same thing. Leah opened the truck door. Dad left me a store, Ethan. She paused. He didn't leave me a sentence to die in. The words had no anger in them. That made them difficult to defend against. Ethan looked at Slate. The shepherd had remained beside Leah, not guarding her, not taking sides, simply staying closest to the person whose voice had gone quiet. Ethan realized he had spent years thinking of Leah as the one who stayed. He had never asked whether she wanted that description to become permanent. I didn't know, he said. I know. That was not forgiveness, but it was honest. The next afternoon, Elena Park called Ethan and asked if she could stop by Leah's house. She was not alone. Grant Mercer arrived first, carrying his county tablet and looking unhappy about the temperature. Elena came 10 minutes later. A third vehicle pulled in behind her. The pickup was a work truck with North Star decals on the doors, but none of the polished appearance of Richard Sloane's company vehicles. The man who stepped out was Caleb Stroud, 52, North Star's site superintendent. Caleb had the thick forearms and heavy hands of somebody who had spent more years around tools than conference tables. His sandy brown hair had thinned across the top, and a short mustache was going silver. He carried a dark leather tool bag with blue tape wrapped around one handle. Ethan knew why Elena wanted to speak with him. Megan had confirmed Oliver called Caleb the night he disappeared. North Star's gate records also showed Caleb leaving Mesa Vista that evening. Elena had enough information that pretending ignorance was no longer useful. The meeting at Leah's house was Caleb's choice. He had agreed to speak voluntarily, but said he would not do it inside North Star's office, and did not want to go to the sheriff's substation unless required. Elena had been at Leah's already to check on Slate's temporary custody arrangement. The backyard offered privacy. Nothing more. Slate was beneath the porch shade when Caleb walked through the gate. The change in the dog was immediate. Slate rose. Ethan expected tension. Instead, the shepherd walked directly toward Caleb. Caleb stopped. For the first time since arriving, the man's face lost its guarded expression. Hey, Slate. The dog sniffed his work pants, then the leather tool bag. His tail moved once. Slate sat beside Caleb's boot. Caleb stared down at him. Slowly, he scratched behind the shepherd's right ear, exactly where the tip folded inward. There you are. There was familiarity in the motion, not the awkward affection of a stranger meeting a well-known dog. Habit. Ethan looked at Elena. She had seen it too, but she did not write anything down. Slate recognizing Caleb was not evidence of where Oliver had gone. Elena already had evidence that Caleb knew Oliver. What Slate changed was the man. Caleb set the tool bag down. Slate stayed beside it. Elena opened her burgundy notebook. You told me Monday you hadn't spoken to Oliver Trent in the week before he disappeared. Caleb rubbed a thumb across the seam of his work pants. I said I didn't know where he went. You also said you didn't remember speaking with him. Caleb looked toward the yard. Slate's head rested against the side of his boot. The dog did not know he was making honesty harder. That was probably why it worked. Caleb exhaled. I remember. No one moved. Elena waited. Caleb finally looked at Ethan. Oliver and me worked those monitoring points together for months. Not every day. Enough. He nodded toward Slate. Dog came most mornings. Oliver said Slate had better attendance than half the subcontractors. Ethan could hear Oliver in the joke, despite never having met him. Elena asked about the night Oliver disappeared. Caleb took longer this time. Then the story came out in pieces. Oliver had called because he wanted to check the old groundwater observation well outside town. The well was the reference point Megan had shown them. Caleb had access because North Star used the county monitoring network during Mesa Vista construction. They drove there separately. Caleb unlocked the site. Oliver took readings. The reference well had remained relatively stable. The monitoring points nearer Mesa Vista had not. That bothered him, Caleb said. How much? Grant asked. Enough that he wanted pumping reduced until the engineers reviewed it again. Grant folded his arms. Did you agree? Caleb stared at the ground. I thought slowing down for a day wouldn't kill anybody. That wasn't my question. Caleb looked at him. Yes. I thought he had a point. After the well check, Caleb drove back to Mesa Vista. Oliver followed. At the service yard, Richard Sloan was still there. Oliver showed him the comparison. The argument began quietly. Caleb had been loading equipment into his truck and heard enough to understand what was happening. Richard did not threaten Oliver physically. He did not tell anyone to destroy evidence. He warned Oliver that if he publicly claimed North Star had caused structural damage before the data completed formal review, the company would protect itself. Lawyers, contract disputes, questions about Oliver's methodology, potential claims against his consulting firm. He told Oliver he could spend the next 3 years proving a sentence he said in 3 minutes, Caleb said. Ethan pictured Richard saying it calmly. That seemed more believable than shouting. And Oliver, Elena asked, said he wasn't going public. Caleb paused. He said he was taking the readings to a state engineer in the morning. Grant's attention sharpened. Who? I don't know. Oliver didn't say. The meeting had changed meaning. Oliver had not vanished after making vague complaints. He had made a specific plan for the next morning. Caleb watched him leave Mesa Vista shortly after midnight. Richard had told Caleb to go home. Let legal handle it, Richard had said. Then the next day, Oliver failed to appear. By evening, people were asking questions. Caleb knew he had been one of the last people to see him. He still said nothing. Why? Elena asked. The question carried no anger. Caleb looked at Slate. Because I had 83 people working under me on that site. He swallowed. If the county stopped Mesa Vista, some of them got reassigned. Some didn't. I told myself Oliver probably went somewhere on his own. Told myself the meeting didn't matter. And when the missing person case kept going? Elena asked. Caleb's mouth tightened. Every day it got harder to explain why I hadn't said something the day before. There was no noble version of that. Caleb knew it. So did everyone else. Slate shifted and laid his head across Caleb's boot. The man looked down. I know, he whispered. The words were for the dog more than anyone. Elena did not soften the question. Which direction did Oliver drive? Toward the highway. You saw him reach it? Caleb frowned. No. That distinction mattered. Within 2 hours, Elena had county maintenance reviewing traffic cameras around the relevant roads. Ashford Mesa did not have a citywide surveillance system. Most cameras existed for practical reasons, checking intersections, flood channels, maintenance yards. The first 2 gave them nothing. The third was an old county camera mounted near the junction of Mesa Road and Canyon Service Road. Its image was grainy. The timestamp worked. At 12:43 a.m., a vehicle matching Oliver Trent's SUV turned west, not toward the highway, toward Canyon Service Road. Grant stared at the still image in the county office. That road's restricted. Ethan looked at him. Since when? Spring. Canyon Service Road ran through dry, low hills west of Ashford Mesa. One section had developed localized subsidence and erosion after changes in runoff and drainage patterns from several infrastructure projects. Mesa Vista was one contributor to that system through a temporary discharge route used during dewatering. Not the only contributor. Not the same ground problem as Bellwether Hall. Grant was careful about that. "This isn't one giant sinkhole stretching across the county," he said. "Different soil, different drainage problem." But Oliver knew about it. He'd asked questions. Elena looked at Caleb. Why would he go there at 1 a.m? Caleb sat very still. Then something changed in his face. Not revelation. Memory. At the service yard. Elena waited. Caleb rubbed a hand over his mustache. There was a tanker leaving when Oliver and Richard finished arguing. What kind? Water truck. North Star used them for construction water and handling some temporary site flows. Caleb's brows drew together. I didn't think about it then. Where did it go? Elena asked. West Gate. Toward Canyon Road. Ethan felt the room tighten. Caleb looked at Grant. That truck wasn't scheduled on Canyon. Grant's eyes narrowed. Are you sure? Road was under load restriction. Drivers knew it. Caleb stared at the camera image of Oliver's SUV turning west at 12:43 in the morning. The pieces were still incomplete. They did not know whether Oliver followed the tanker. They did not know whether the truck had anything to do with his disappearance. They did not know where Oliver's vehicle went after leaving the camera's view. But for the first time in 12 days, the direction of his last known movement had changed. Caleb spoke quietly. I remember Oliver looking at that truck. He closed his eyes for a second. Then he said, that one shouldn't be going down that road. Elena closed her notebook. Nobody in the room tried to turn the sentence into more than it was. They did not need to. Until that afternoon, the search for Oliver Trent had been pointed toward the highway. Now it wasn't. The search began before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. At 5:40 in the morning, Canyon Service Road was still blue with shadow, the air cool enough to make Ashford Mesa's July heat feel temporarily negotiable. That would not last. County rescue crews gathered beside a locked maintenance gate west of town. 2 four-wheel drive vehicles waited on the shoulder. Cases of water, radios, first aid supplies, shade tarps, and mapping equipment were stacked beneath a pop-up canopy. Ethan stood near the back of a county truck, while a rescue coordinator divided the search area into sectors. He did not offer to take command. That was not his job. His experience could help with terrain, search spacing, and reading a map under pressure. The county team knew the land, the local roads, and the procedures governing a civilian search. Ethan had no reason to confuse usefulness with authority. Elena Park noticed. You're being very cooperative, she said. Don't sound disappointed. I had paperwork prepared. Ethan almost smiled. 20 yards away, Slate stood beside Leah under the shade canopy. The German Shepherd was not wearing a search harness. There was no handler pretending he had suddenly become a trained tracking dog because it made a better story. Camille Hart had been firm. Slate could come to the staging point because Oliver's scent, belongings, and possible recovery might make his presence useful later. He was not going into unstable terrain. He's a 6-year-old German Shepherd. Who knows one man? Camille had told Ethan before sunrise. He's not a county search because he has good cheekbones. Now Slate watched every vehicle that moved through the gate. Ethan walked over and crouched beside him. Your part comes later. Slate looked beyond him toward the canyon road. Leah held the leash. He understands every word except the ones he disagrees with. That runs in the family. Leah raised an eyebrow. Ethan let the comment stand. The road ahead twisted through dry, low hills, cut by shallow drainage channels and old utility routes. Canyon Service Road had once carried county maintenance trucks regularly, but several sections had been restricted since spring. The problem was not one dramatic sinkhole. It was more ordinary, and therefore easier to underestimate. Water had changed where it moved. Some drainage channels had been redirected during infrastructure work. Temporary discharge systems had added flow in places that had not carried much for years. Heat dried the surface hard, while runoff weakened soil underneath. A road could look trustworthy right up until a tire proved otherwise. The old county camera had shown Oliver Trent's SUV turning onto this road at 12:43 a.m., 11 nights earlier. Until Caleb Stroud spoke, no one had known to look here. That fact sat heavily over the morning. At 6:15, the first team moved out. Ethan joined a group traveling the eastern section under the direction of county rescue personnel. He carried water, a radio, and a printed terrain map marked with the last camera position. They found the first sign less than an hour later. Not Oliver. Tire marks, old enough that wind and traffic had softened them, but they left the main road near a section where the outside shoulder had slumped. The rescue coordinator stopped the vehicles. Everyone continued on foot. Ethan moved carefully along the road edge, looking not for drama but for interrupted patterns. Broken brush, freshly exposed soil that had not weathered like the ground around it, a change in the angle of branches. Down the slope, perhaps 30 feet below the road, something reflected morning light. Ethan stopped. Vehicle. The others followed his line of sight. A dark SUV sat partly hidden behind low mesquite and gray-green scrub. The front end pointed downward. One wheel had slipped into collapsed soil. The vehicle had not rolled. It had simply left the road far enough to disappear from anyone driving past above. The team approached only after checking the slope. Ethan felt his breathing become quieter. Not faster. Quieter. The driver's door was closed. No broken glass. No damage suggesting another vehicle had struck it. No visible sign of a struggle around the exterior. The rescue coordinator opened the door after Elena authorized the search. The inside smelled of dust, stale heat, and an abandoned cup of coffee. Oliver was not there. On the passenger floor lay 2 empty water bottles. A reflective field vest hung over the back of the seat. A notebook sat beneath the center console. There was a folded topographic map on the passenger side, and beside it lay a dark nylon dog leash. Slates. Ethan knew before anyone told him. The clasp was worn. A few black and gold hairs clung to the fabric near the handle. He picked it up only after Elena photographed it. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. 11 days earlier, Slate had remained in Ashford Mesa. Now the leash in Oliver's vehicle offered a quiet answer to a question nobody had needed to ask aloud. Oliver had not taken Slate on the trip. The leash was a spare he kept in the SUV. This was supposed to have been a short drive. Check something. Come home. Resume the morning routine. At 6:20, Slate would expect the door to open. Ethan ran one thumb over the woven handle. Oliver's house still had food in it. His work calendar had appointments scheduled the next morning. A spare leash waited in the car for the dog he expected to see again. This was not the vehicle of a man arranging to vanish. Elena looked at Ethan. "You all right?" "Yeah." He set the leash back exactly where it had been. Now we find where he walked. The map gave them the first useful direction. Several locations were circled in pencil. One was the old groundwater reference well. Another marked the problematic road section farther west. But one small square had been underlined twice. Grant Mercer recognized it over the radio. "Old County Water Inspection Station." "How far?" Elena asked. 2.5 miles from that vehicle, maybe 3 depending on route. "Still active?" "Barely." Grant explained that the station had once served crews maintaining a buried water line through the hills. Most operations had moved elsewhere, but the site still had a shaded equipment structure and a maintenance cistern replenished periodically, because county workers occasionally used the location. Ethan looked toward the brightening western hills. If Oliver had walked away from the SUV after midnight, he had choices. Return up the slope to a damaged road and hope someone passed. Walk toward town with limited water. Or head for the one place on his map where he knew shade and stored water existed. A structural engineer who spent his career thinking about systems would not need heroism to make that choice. Only practicality. The rescue coordinator changed the search plan. 2 teams would approach the station by separate safe routes. No one rushed. The sun was higher now. The hills had begun losing their morning color, flattening toward hard gold and gray. By 9:30, the temperature was climbing fast. Ethan's team reached the remains of an old maintenance track. A faded county marker leaned beside the path. Then a voice came over the radio. Possible structure in sight. They slowed. The old inspection station was little more than a concrete utility building attached to a metal shade roof. Dust had collected against one wall. The maintenance road leading to it was too rough for ordinary traffic. One rescue worker called out. No answer. They moved closer. Then Ethan heard something from inside. Not a cry, a cough, weak enough that the first sound might have been wind moving through metal. The rescue coordinator raised one hand. Oliver Trent? Silence. Then a voice. Rough. Thin. But human. Yeah. For 11 days, Oliver Trent had been a name in reports, a face on a missing person flyer, a gap in Slate's routine. Now he was alive in a small building in the hills. The county team reached him first. Ethan stayed where he was told. That mattered. Oliver sat against an interior wall in the deepest strip of shade. A plastic maintenance container beside him held water. His clothes were dusty, his face deeply tired, and one leg was stretched carefully in front of him. He looked thinner than the photographs Elena had shown around town, but he was alert. He knew his name. He knew the date was wrong by several days, and laughed weakly when a medic corrected him. 11? Oliver said. The medic nodded. Oliver closed his eyes. That explains the beard. The joke was poor. Everyone was relieved enough to accept it. He had survived because the station offered exactly what he had hoped it would. Shade. Water. Not comfort. Not food. Not rescue. Just enough. After leaving his SUV in the dark, Oliver had tried to walk back toward the road. The uneven ground turned his ankle badly enough that continuing became harder by the hour. He changed direction toward the station because he knew the cistern existed. Once there, heat and limited mobility trapped him in a cruel equation. Walk several miles under July sun without reliable water and risk collapsing where no one could see him. Or stay beside water and hope somebody eventually searched the right place. He had chosen to stay. It had been the rational decision. It had also nearly become permanent. The medic stabilized him and prepared transport. Ethan radioed Leah. We found him. For a second, there was no response. Then Leah said, Alive? Alive. A breath traveled through the radio. Ethan looked toward Oliver. There's someone else who needs to hear that. Slate arrived only after the rescue coordinator declared the immediate area secure enough for Leah to bring him to the outer staging point. Camille came too. She had made no attempt to hide how strongly she disapproved of putting a recently recovered dog near a search operation. She also knew exactly why he needed to be there now. Slate stepped out of Leah's truck. The shepherd was alert, but controlled. Then a voice carried across the staging area. A medic was helping Oliver into a seated transport chair beneath the shade. Oliver said something Ethan could not hear. Slate did. The dog's entire body changed. His head lifted. His ears came forward. He stood so quickly the leash drew tight. Not panic. Recognition. Ethan took the leash from Leah. Easy. Slate pulled once, harder than he had pulled toward Bellwether Hall. Ethan held him. Oliver looked up. For a moment he seemed not to understand what he was seeing. Then the exhaustion in his face broke open. "Slate." Ethan loosened the leash. The shepherd crossed the distance quickly. He did not jump onto Oliver. He did not crash into the chair. At the last few feet, Slate slowed. Then he pressed his head between Oliver's hands. Oliver bent forward. His forehead rested against the dog's. Slate stood absolutely still. No barking. No licking. No performance. Just contact. Oliver's fingers moved through the black and gold fur behind the right ear with the bent tip. "You waited." His voice failed on the second word. Slate leaned harder into him. Ethan stepped away. For a few seconds, Oliver's disappearance, Bellwether Hall, North Star, groundwater, red maps, and missing files became smaller than one simple fact. A man had come back. His dog knew him, and Slate's unfinished mourning had finally reached the part where Oliver returned. Camille stood beside Ethan. "He'll need a proper exam," she said quietly. "So will Oliver. I'm a veterinarian. Limited ambition." She almost smiled. Then her eyes went back to Slate and Oliver. "Don't ruin this by talking." Ethan obeyed. Oliver spent the afternoon at the county hospital. Doctors confirmed severe dehydration and exhaustion, along with a badly sprained ankle, but no major injury. He needed fluids, rest, observation, and time. Elena did not question him immediately. That was another thing Ethan respected. Finding a missing man alive did not create permission to use him before he could think clearly. By the following afternoon, Oliver was strong enough for a short conversation. Slate lay beneath the chair beside his hospital bed, not near the door, not facing two exits. Under Oliver, exactly where May had once described him. Ethan stood near the window, while Ilona asked the first question. "Why Canyon Road?" Oliver looked at Slate before answering. "Truck." Caleb's memory had been right. After Oliver's argument with Richard Sloan at Mesa Vista, Oliver had seen a North Star water tanker leave through the west gate. The route bothered him immediately. Canyon Service Road was under load restriction. More important, Oliver believed the truck was carrying water associated with the project's dewatering operations toward a temporary discharge area that was not clearly represented on the public drainage plans he had reviewed. "I didn't know they were doing anything illegal," Oliver said. Elena nodded. "You followed because you wanted to see where it went." "Yes. Why not wait until morning?" Oliver looked embarrassed. "Because I was angry." It was the first answer he gave that sounded completely human. He had spent weeks arguing about groundwater. That night, he had finally seen a vehicle going somewhere it should not have been going. He made a decision before caution caught up. Oliver drove west. His SUV reached the weakened section of Canyon Road. The outer edge gave way under one front tire. The car slipped off the shoulder. After that, the tanker was gone. "What about your phone?" Elena asked. Oliver frowned. "In the car." It wasn't there. That disturbed him more than Ethan expected. "I left it in the center tray." "Could you have taken it when you walked out?" "I don't think so." Elena did not turn uncertainty into accusation. Neither did Ethan. The phone could have fallen. Oliver could be remembering incorrectly after 11 days of heat and exhaustion. Someone could have reached the vehicle later. For now, the missing phone was a question. Nothing more. Oliver seemed to lose interest in it quickly. "Phone doesn't matter." Elena leaned forward. "What does?" "The raw recorder." Ethan looked at him. Oliver explained that 2 days before disappearing, he had shipped the original physical data recorder from the Bellwether monitoring system to a university laboratory for calibration. He had questioned whether drift in one sensor might be affecting part of his data. A careful engineer did not accuse a multi-million-dollar project based on equipment he had not independently checked. So Oliver sent the recorder out. "Where is it now?" Elena asked. University lab, or shipping back by now. No safe hidden under a floor, no secret evidence locker, no dramatic copy buried for someone to find. The most important technical record had survived because Oliver had done something boring and professionally responsible. He had mailed equipment to a laboratory. Grant came to the hospital that evening carrying a folder. He waited until Oliver had eaten, rested, and agreed to look at it. Inside was the red zone proposal Northstar had circulated after the earthquake. Attached to the proposal was a technical map carrying Oliver's name and signature. Ethan watched Oliver study it. The room became quiet. Oliver touched the signature. "That's mine." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Grant said nothing. Oliver turned the page slightly. Then his finger stopped at the title printed above the map. He read it twice. A tired laugh escaped him. Not because anything was funny. Where did they say this came from? Northstar submitted it as supporting technical material for the long-term evacuation proposal, Grant said. Oliver looked at him. This wasn't a long-term evacuation recommendation. He turned the document so Ethan could see the title. Worst-case emergency evacuation scenario, exercise planning draft. Oliver had prepared it months earlier for a tabletop emergency exercise. It showed the area that might need to be cleared under a severe combination of structural failure, utility damage, and secondary ground movement. It was deliberately broad. That was the point of the exercise. "What did you sign?" Ethan asked. That the scenario was technically reasonable for emergency planning. Not that this was the current danger zone. No. Oliver leaned back against the pillow. For several seconds, exhaustion showed through his anger. Then he looked at the red boundary again. Northstar had not needed to forge his name. They had not needed to invent his map. The document was real. The signature was real. The danger described on it was real, under the conditions for which it had been created. What changed was the purpose. A worst-case planning tool had been placed beside a real earthquake and allowed to sound like a present-tense conclusion. Oliver looked across the room at Ethan. His hand dropped beneath the chair. Slate immediately moved his head into it. Oliver scratched slowly behind the dog's bent ear. "You don't always have to fake a report," he said. His voice was tired but clear. "Sometimes you just make sure people only read the part that helps you." Slate closed his eyes beneath Oliver's hand. Ethan looked at the map again. 11 days earlier, Oliver Trent had driven into the dark because he wanted to know where one truck was going. Now he was back. And for the first time since the earthquake, the people arguing over Ashford Mesa had something more valuable than another accusation. They had the man whose work everyone else had been interpreting for him. The data recorder came back in a plain cardboard shipping box. No police escort, no dramatic seal, no note warning anyone to stand back. A university laboratory label crossed one corner, and beneath it, someone had written, "Calibration complete" in black marker. Oliver Trent looked at the box for several seconds before opening it. Slate was lying beneath the temporary desk beside him. The office had once been a tax preparation storefront, 2 blocks from Bellwether Hall. Grant Mercer had arranged it as a temporary workspace, while Oliver recovered. A folding table held engineering drawings, 2 monitors, a county laptop, and enough cables to make the place look less like an office than a machine waiting to be assembled. Oliver's ankle was still braced. He moved carefully. Slate moved when Oliver moved. When Oliver sat, Slate settled. When Oliver reached for his field bag, the German shepherd lifted his head as if expecting the old day to begin again. Ethan stood near the window with Grant, Elena Park, and Denise Rowland from the independent engineering team. No one treated the recorder like a verdict. That mattered. It contained raw measurements. It did not contain motives. For most of the morning, the room was quiet except for keyboard taps, the hum of an air conditioning unit struggling against July. and the occasional click of Oliver's mechanical pencil. The laboratory had confirmed that one sensor showed minor drift, but not enough to explain the larger pattern. Denise combined the corrected readings with the local instruments recovered from Bellwether Hall, then groundwater records from the reference well 6 miles outside town, then Mesa Vista's dewatering schedule, then soil reports, then the post-earthquake structural survey. The picture became clearer by becoming less simple. Bellwether Hall had real weaknesses. The south section could not safely reopen without significant work. Parts of the roof structure needed removal. 3 load points required reinforcement. The lowered foundation zone needed stabilization. Oliver did not argue with any of it. That surprised some people. It did not surprise Ethan anymore. "You'd take part of it down?" Ethan asked. Oliver looked at the structural drawing. "If part of a building is unsafe, you don't preserve it by pretending." He tapped the south wing. "You preserve the rest by telling the truth about this part." That sentence stayed with Ethan. The groundwater picture was more complicated. Mesa Vista's excavation had required sustained pumping to keep the construction pit dry. The corrected data showed that pressure changes in the surrounding groundwater and small soil movements near Bellwether Hall lined up strongly enough with heavier dewatering periods that the independent team could no longer dismiss the relationship as ordinary background noise. It still did not mean North Star had caused every crack. Bellwether Hall was old. Its south side had weaknesses before Mesa Vista. The earthquake had added real damage. But Grant now had enough technical support to require North Star to redesign parts of its pumping, shoring, and drainage system before work continued. Canyon Service Road was separate. The road had its own drainage and erosion problems related to multiple infrastructure changes, including temporary discharge flows connected to Mesa Vista. It was not one underground wound, stretching 6 miles beneath Ashford Mesa. Grant insisted that distinction appear in every public summary. "I am not letting this town replace one oversimplification with another," he said. The most important number arrived just before lunch. Denise placed 2 maps side by side. On the left was North Star's proposed long-term red zone. On the right was the independent team's current safety perimeter. The second map was smaller. Much smaller. Bellwether Hall's south section remained inside. A few nearby areas required continued monitoring, but Hale Hardware was outside the long-term closure zone. So were the diner, the apartment row, and most of the houses North Star's map had enclosed. Leah came over when Ethan called. She stood beside him in the temporary office and looked at the 2 maps without speaking. Ethan expected relief. She gave him something more cautious. "So the store is safe?" Grant answered. "Based on the information we have, it does not belong in a long-term evacuation zone." "Does that mean nothing can change?" "No." Leah nodded. "Good answer." Grant almost smiled. Ethan looked at the independent map again. For 2 weeks, the red line had seemed like a wall around the future. Now it looked like what it had always been. A proposal. A choice somebody had drawn. The next question was why. Elena handled that part differently from the engineers. She did not ask whether North Star had wanted Bellwether Hall to fail. No evidence supported that. She did not ask whether Richard Sloan had caused the earthquake. No sane person was claiming that. She asked narrower questions. Who assembled the public packet? Who selected the emergency exercise map as supporting material? Who knew Appendix C was absent? Who approved the groundwater model shown to the city? Who knew Oliver had met Richard the night he disappeared? Who decided not to tell police? The answers did not point toward one hidden master plan. They pointed toward a chain. Appendix C had not been included in the packet used publicly. The worst-case evacuation exercise map had been attached to North Star's red zone proposal without prominent explanation that it had been designed for an emergency planning scenario. The narrower groundwater model had been preferred in city presentations, even though broader comparisons were used internally. Oliver's warnings had repeatedly been described as unresolved professional disagreement. And when Oliver disappeared, Richard Sloane knew about the confrontation at Mesa Vista and knew Oliver had left after seeing the westbound tanker. He did not tell Elena, not because Richard knew Oliver was injured. There was no evidence of that. He remained silent because disclosure would have pulled Canyon Road, groundwater handling, and Oliver's concerns into the missing person investigation. And that could have stopped Mesa Vista. Financial records added the motive that technical documents could not. Northstar had signed contingent purchase options with several property owners around the old commercial district. The contracts were legal on their face. Some owners wanted them. May Holloway was considering one freely. But several agreements became substantially more valuable to Northstar if the affected properties entered extended closure or lost practical commercial use. A broad red zone would make assembling land for Mesa Vista cheaper and easier. Ethan read one summary twice. "You can write a contract like that?" Elena looked at him. "You can write many things into a contract if both sides agree. Doesn't make it decent." "No." She closed the file. "Also doesn't make every person who signed one a victim." May would have appreciated that distinction. Richard Sloane arrived for a scheduled county interview that afternoon with an attorney. Ethan was not present. Elena later told him only what could appropriately be shared. Richard denied trying to mislead the town. He said Northstar had used conservative safety assumptions after an earthquake. He said purchase options were ordinary development tools. He said conflicting groundwater models reflected legitimate professional uncertainty. On Oliver, his defense was simpler. He had assumed the engineer had left town voluntarily after an angry disagreement. Ethan did not believe that explanation. Belief was not the same thing as proof. Elena seemed determined to preserve that difference all the way to the end. Oliver struggled with a different question, his own part. The day before the county hearing, Ethan found him outside the temporary office beneath a narrow shade awning. Slate lay beside Oliver's chair. Across the street, crews were securing the south side of Bellwether Hall. Oliver watched them work. "I should have shut that section sooner," he said. Ethan leaned against the wall. "You recommended closure." "Eventually." Oliver rubbed the eraser end of his pencil against his palm. "I spent too much time trying not to sound like the man who hated development." "You didn't." "I know that. Now." He looked at the hall. Back then, every meeting had two rooms in it, the technical one and the political one. If I said the south wing needed immediate closure, I thought Northstar would use it to argue the whole building was finished. If I pushed too hard on groundwater without complete calibration, they'd call me reckless. "So you waited. Longer than I should have." The admission did not make Oliver guilty of what Northstar had done. It made him human inside the same system. Megan had stayed quiet because her mother depended on her insurance. Caleb had stayed quiet because dozens of workers depended on the project. Oliver had softened his urgency because he feared losing credibility. Richard had stayed quiet because millions of dollars and years of planning were at risk. Different reasons, different responsibilities, but the same habit. Wait. Let somebody else say the difficult thing first. Slate lifted his head when Oliver stopped scratching behind his ear. Oliver noticed and resumed. Ethan looked toward Bellwether Hall. How many bad things start with somebody thinking one more day won't matter? Oliver gave him a tired smile. Engineers usually call that deferred maintenance. The county hearing began at 6 the next evening. This time, there were no glossy renderings behind Richard Sloane. The room was arranged for testimony. Grant Mercer spoke first. He explained the independent safety assessment in language ordinary people could follow. Bellwether Hall had genuine structural damage. Its south wing could not reopen as it stood. Some components would need controlled removal. Other areas could be repaired. The broader neighborhood did not require the long-term evacuation perimeter Northstar had proposed. Mesa Vista's current dewatering and drainage approach could not continue unchanged. The project would need revised engineering controls and independent review. There were no cheers. That was good. People were listening. Oliver spoke next. He used diagrams but kept them simple. He explained the reference well. He explained why local movement did not prove a regional collapse. He explained why the worst-case exercise map had never been intended as a present-day evacuation recommendation. Then he said something Ethan had not expected. "I should have been clearer earlier. That part of Bellwether Hall needed immediate closure." The room stirred. Oliver did not retreat from it. Preservation does not mean calling unsafe things safe. Development does not mean calling repairable things useless. We have been arguing as if those are the only choices. Slate lay beneath Oliver's chair. When Oliver finished, the dog lifted his head but did not move. Megan testified after him. Her voice shook during the first minute. Then less. She described the groundwater models. No fake numbers, no invented readings, different assumptions, different emphasis. She explained that the broader model made local changes around Mesa Vista more visible, while the narrower model made uncertainty easier to emphasize. A county attorney asked whether either model was fraudulent. Megan answered carefully, "No." Then she added, "But showing only the model that helps your preferred conclusion is not the same as showing decision-makers the whole uncertainty." Caleb spoke next. He confirmed the night at the observation well, the argument at the service yard, Oliver leaving, the tanker heading west, and his own failure to tell investigators. "I thought I was protecting jobs," Caleb said. His large hands were locked together on the table. "What I protected was my own excuse for not getting involved." No one applauded that either. Elena's testimony was narrower still. Timeline, phone records, the missing person report, Caleb's delayed disclosure, Richard's failure to report the last known meeting. She did not tell the county board what it should do with Mesa Vista. That was not her authority. Then the floor opened to residents. The argument Ethan had heard at the school meeting returned, but it had changed. Now everyone had more facts. A Northstar construction worker stood near the back. "If you stop this project," he said, "what happens to us?" He was not defending Richard. He was asking about his paycheck. The room had to sit with that. May Holloway spoke next. She carried no notes. "I'm still thinking about selling my shop." A few people turned. May looked around the room. "If that disappoints anybody, they're welcome to come unlock it every morning for the next 10 years. A nervous laugh moved through the seats. May continued, "I wanted the truth because I wanted my choice back. That doesn't mean my choice has to be the same as yours." A young couple spoke about wanting to keep the small house they had bought 3 years earlier. A renter asked whether redevelopment would make the neighborhood safer, only to make it too expensive for the people already living there. A restaurant owner wanted Bellwether Hall repaired. Another merchant wanted permission to relocate permanently. Ashford Mesa was not one voice. That was the point. Near the end, a council member looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Hale, you were involved from the day of the earthquake. Do you want to speak?" 2 weeks earlier, Ethan would have stood before anyone who gave him the floor. He knew what he believed. He knew what he wanted protected. He also knew who had spent years paying the loan, opening Hale Hardware in January, replacing employees who quit, and deciding which bills could wait. Ethan looked at Leah. Then he stood only long enough to say, "My sister should answer for our property." He sat back down. Leah stared at him. For a second, she seemed more startled by that than by the earthquake. Then she walked to the microphone. She rested both hands on the podium. "If Hale Hardware is dangerous, tell me it's dangerous," she said. "If part of Bellwether Hall has to come down, take it down safely." Her voice was calm. "If someday I decide to sell my store, I'll sell it." Leia looked toward the county board. "But don't use fear to decide ahead of me what my property is worth, what my neighborhood can become, or whether I'm supposed to stay." The room stayed quiet. She did not ask them to save everything. She asked them to stop confusing protection with permission. Ethan understood the distinction because he had spent the summer learning it the hard way. The county's decisions came late that night. The proposal to demolish all of Bellwether Hall was rejected. The south section would undergo controlled removal and stabilization. The remainder would be evaluated for repair and phased reopening. Mesa Vista's active excavation work would pause, while North Star submitted revised dewatering, shoring, and drainage plans subject to independent review. Contingent purchase agreements connected to the disputed hazard zone would be reviewed by county and state authorities for disclosure and procedural concerns. Richard Sloan would step away from direct management of the project, while questions involving permitting, disclosures, and his conduct during the Oliver Trent missing person investigation were examined. North Star wasn't dissolved. Mesa Vista wasn't canceled. Some people were unhappy about that. Others were relieved. If the project met the new requirements, part of it could still be built. Ashford Mesa had not defeated development. It had forced development to return to the table without the red line deciding the outcome first. After the hearing, Oliver went back to the temporary office. Ethan helped carry a box of documents inside. Slate entered behind them. Oliver set his laptop on the desk. The room was quiet after the crowded hearing hall. He plugged a field reader into one of the newly installed monitoring units. A few seconds later, the device gave a familiar electronic beep. Slate's head came up. The German Shepherd rose from beneath the desk, sat, and stared at Oliver's right hand. Oliver stopped. For the first time since Ethan had met him, the older engineer laughed without exhaustion underneath it. "You remembered that?" Slate waited. Oliver opened his field bag. A biscuit appeared. Slate took it carefully, circled once, and lay back beneath the desk. Oliver rested his hand on the dog's shoulder. Nothing about the gesture solved Ashford Mesa. Bellwether Hall still needed months of work. Mesa Vista still had to prove it could be built safely. Some people would stay. Some would sell. Some would spend years arguing about whether the town had made the right choice. But Slate no longer had to walk the same morning route, waiting for a missing man to finish it. The machine had beeped. Oliver was there. This time, the routine had an ending. By the last week of August, Bellwether Hall looked less like a wounded building and more like a difficult project. Someone had finally decided to finish properly. Scaffolding covered most of the south side. The damaged exterior stairs were gone. A section of roof had been opened to the sky, while crews replaced weakened framing. Temporary fencing still surrounded part of the block, and every morning began with the metallic knock of tools before the heat became too heavy for the loudest work. No one in Ashford Mesa pretended the repair was quick. No one pretended the earthquake had somehow improved everything. The southern wing of Bellwether Hall had been partially dismantled under controlled conditions because saving it exactly as it stood would have required pretending it was safer than it was. For the first few days after demolition, people hated the gap. May Holloway stood outside the temporary market and stared through it. "You can see the sky where Mrs. Bell's bakery used to be." Leah Hale joined her beneath the shade canopy. "You make that sound like a crime." "It feels rude." May folded her arms. "Buildings should have the decency to leave a wall when they go." But the empty space changed once the architects began showing what could replace it. Not another enclosed wing, an open courtyard, a wide emergency exit, a lightweight shade structure, small market stalls that could be removed during festivals, trees planted where the old foundation could no longer support heavy construction. The plan preserved most of Bellwether Hall, while refusing to rebuild its weakest part exactly as before. Oliver Trent approved. That mattered to people who remembered how hard he had fought against using one unsafe section as an excuse to condemn the entire building. "It's not a museum," Oliver said during one planning meeting. "If the only way to preserve it is to freeze it in time, we're doing preservation wrong." Slate lay beneath the table while he spoke. Oliver's ankle had improved enough that he could walk short distances without the brace, though he still moved slowly by the end of each day. He carried his clipboard again. The orange mechanical pencil was back in his shirt pocket, and Slate was almost always beside him. The dog no longer woke at Leah's house at 6:20. He no longer stood beside Ethan's door, waiting to walk a route whose owner had vanished. Oliver had returned home. So had Slate. Most mornings they still crossed Ashford Mesa before the temperature climbed. West Wall, Service Alley, South Corner, new monitoring point. The path had changed where construction fencing blocked the old route, but Slate adapted quickly. Oliver stopped. Checked a reading. A field device beeped. Slate sat. Oliver gave him a biscuit. The behavior had never been mysterious. That was what made it meaningful. Nothing about Slate had changed. The person who was supposed to be there had come back. Ethan saw them most mornings from Hale Hardware. He no longer joined the route, unless Oliver asked for help carrying something. That had taken some adjustment. For weeks, Slate had been part of Ethan's first hour of the day. The house had seemed oddly quiet after the dog moved home. On the first morning without him, Ethan had stepped into Leah's hallway at 6:20 and looked at the empty space beside the door. Leah saw him from the kitchen. "Missing your supervisor?" "House is quieter." Slate was silent. "Exactly." Leah handed him coffee. "You two communicated mostly through disapproval. He was good at it. He learned from me." Ethan took the cup and did not argue. The temporary market stayed open throughout the repairs. By late August, it had developed its own habits. Fans turned under white tents from dawn until closing. Produce vendors stacked peaches and tomatoes beneath damp cloths. Older customers occupied the same shaded folding chairs every morning and complained whenever somebody moved them 3 feet. Children ran between stalls until their parents threatened consequences nobody believed. The drill noise from Bellwether Hall mixed with vendors calling prices and the occasional beep of reversing construction equipment. It was not beautiful in the polished way North Star's Mesa Vista renderings had been beautiful. It was better than that. It looked used. Some people decided to stay. Some did not. May Holloway sold her sewing shop. When she told Ethan, she did it while labeling 3 cardboard boxes. He stood inside her temporary stall and looked at the neat stacks of fabric being divided into keep, sell, and donate. "You made up your mind." May did not stop writing. "Yes. You happy about it?" "No." She placed another bundle in the keep box. "I'm also happy about it." Ethan smiled. "That clears everything up." May looked over her glasses. "At 74, you learn 2 things can be true without asking permission." Her daughter lived several hours away. May had already found a small apartment nearby, with enough room for her sewing machine, and a balcony she claimed had an unacceptable view of a golf course. The buyer was a young couple from Ashford Mesa named Nora and Daniel Reed, who wanted to run alterations, custom work, and a small fabric shop once Bellwether Hall reopened. They had one request. They wanted to keep the old sign. May walked with them to the fenced storefront on a morning when workers were removing damaged trim. The sign read, "Holloway Stitch and Cloth." The paint had faded. One corner needed repair. Daniel asked, "Would you mind if we kept Holloway on it?" May stared at the sign. Nora quickly added, "We could change it if that feels strange." May took her time answering. Then she said, "Keep the name until the paint gives up." Nora smiled. May pointed at her. "After that, it's your shop. Don't spend the next 30 years asking a dead woman what color she wanted the sign." Ethan heard about the exchange later from Leah. He thought it sounded exactly like May. Mesa Vista changed too. North Star did not disappear from Ashford Mesa. The project was reduced and redesigned. The underground excavation plan was modified. Independent groundwater monitoring became mandatory. The temporary discharge system was replaced. Additional shoring was required before deeper work resumed. Several structures North Star had originally hoped to incorporate into a larger assembled parcel remained in private hands. Other owners still sold willingly. Construction eventually restarted in a limited section. Some residents protested. Some celebrated. Most did both, depending on the day. Ashford Mesa still needed housing. It still needed jobs. The truth about Bellwether Hall had not erased those facts. It had simply removed the convenience of pretending the old neighborhood had no future, except the one North Star had already drawn. Richard Sloan did not return to the public meetings. The reviews involving disclosure, permitting, and his failure to provide information during Oliver's disappearance continued through legal and administrative channels. Ethan followed the updates at first, then less. The town no longer needed him to stand guard over the story. Megan Pierce left North Star before the end of August. She accepted a position with a smaller engineering firm in another county that allowed her to keep comparable health coverage for her mother. On her last afternoon in Ashford Mesa, she stopped at the temporary market. Oliver was there reviewing a drainage plan. Megan stood several feet away until he looked up. For a moment, neither knew what kind of conversation they were supposed to have. Finally, Megan said, "I should have spoken sooner." Oliver put down his pencil. "So should I." That was all. No dramatic forgiveness. No absolution. Megan crouched to scratch Slate beneath the jaw. Slate accepted the attention, then returned to Oliver's side. Caleb Stroud stayed in construction. North Star reassigned him away from direct supervision while the project review continued, but an independent contractor later hired him to coordinate several of the new drainage and safety modifications. Ethan found some irony in that. Caleb did too. "Apparently, confession qualifies as continuing education," he said one morning. Grant Mercer, standing beside him, replied, "Only if you pass the exam afterward." Caleb did not laugh much, but he showed up. That counted. By then, Ethan's own departure had become a practical matter. His marine logistics contract was still waiting. The company needed him at a coastal freight terminal in early September. For several weeks, people assumed he would cancel. Leah never did. One evening, while they were closing Hale Hardware, Ethan found her sitting on the front counter with a folder beside her. The store had reopened after the county confirmed it sat outside the long-term hazard zone. Business was still uneven, but earthquake repairs had created an unexpected rush for fasteners, work gloves, extension cords, tarps, batteries, and every kind of hardware used by people fixing old buildings. Ethan picked up the folder. "Another offer?" "No." Leah took it back. "It's the North Star one." The offer period had nearly expired. Ethan waited. Weeks earlier, he would already have been asking what she intended to do. Now he leaned against the counter. Leah noticed. "You're getting annoyingly patient." "I'm working on it. I liked you better when you fixed things without permission." "No, you didn't." "No. But it was easier to complain." She opened the folder. "I'm not selling." Ethan felt relief move through him before he could stop it. Leah saw that too. "Don't get excited. I didn't say anything. You have the face again." He looked down at the counter. "Why are you keeping it?" Leah closed the folder. "Not because of Dad." Ethan nodded. "Not because of you." Another nod. "Not because Bellwether Hall survived." He waited. Leah looked through the front window toward the scaffolding across the street. "I want to see what another season looks like." That was the answer. Not forever. Not never. Another season. Leah smiled slightly. "Maybe I sell next year. Maybe I change the business. Maybe I hire a manager and work 3 days a week. Maybe I get sick of all of you and move to New Mexico." "You hate New Mexico." "I can learn." Ethan smiled. He understood something he would not have understood in July. Leah did not need a permanent decision to prove she loved Hale Hardware. She only needed the decision to remain hers. A few days later, Grant approached Ethan with an idea. Ashford Mesa wanted to create a small preparedness program for local businesses and older residents. Nothing elaborate. Evacuation plans, backup contacts, basic supply lists, clear exit routes. A system for checking residents who lived alone after earthquakes, fires, or long power outages. Grant wanted Ethan to help design it. Ethan looked at him. "You know I'm leaving." "I heard. So why ask me?" "Because leaving and being useful are not mutually exclusive." Grant proposed something simple. Ethan could help build the program now, then return several times a year for exercises and updates when his work schedule allowed. No permanent position, no grand commitment, no demand that he prove loyalty by staying. Ethan agreed. The first drill took place at the temporary market. May complained that the emergency vest made her look like a very old traffic cone. Camille volunteered to create a pet evacuation checklist. Leah organized batteries and flashlights. Oliver reviewed building exits. Slate spent most of the exercise beneath the sign-in table until a test alarm sounded. He stood, looked at Oliver. Oliver pointed toward the designated exit. Slate moved with him. Not fear. Routine. Ethan watched them and thought about how much of safety was simply knowing what to do before fear had to make the decision for you. At the end of August, the first section of Bellwether Hall reopened. Not the entire building, not enough for every merchant to return, but enough for people to walk through the west entrance, cross the restored central floor, and see the new courtyard taking shape where the south wing had stood. For the opening, nobody cut a ribbon. May said ribbons created unnecessary expectations. Instead, the market vendors carried in folding tables and began working. Peaches, bread, coffee, tools, fabric. Ordinary things reclaimed the space faster than speeches could have. Ethan's last afternoon in Ashford Mesa arrived under a pale blue sky. His bags were packed in the pickup. The faded canvas key strap from Hale Hardware hung from the ignition, the small brass washer from his father's old shop key catching light whenever the truck moved. Leah stood outside the hardware store with her arms folded. "You packed everything?" "Yes." "Toothbrush?" "I'm 43. That is not an answer." "Yes." "Phone charger?" "Yes." "Good. You're growing." Across the street, Bellwether Hall was busy. Scaffolding still covered one side. The reopened section held customers. Workers were installing shade beams over the future courtyard. May stood near the entrance, talking to Nora and Daniel Reed beneath the old Holloway sign, which had been removed for repair and leaned temporarily against the wall. Ethan heard a familiar beep. He looked toward the south monitoring station. Oliver stood beside a newly installed marker with a handheld reader. Slate sat at his left side. Oliver looked down. "You are the most predictable creature in this town." He reached into his field bag. Slate received his biscuit. Then the dog looked across the street. At Ethan. Slate stood. Oliver did not call him back. Ethan did not call him over. The shepherd crossed the safe pedestrian lane at an easy trot. He stopped beside Ethan. Ethan crouched. Slate pushed his muzzle beneath Ethan's hand. The right ear still folded slightly at the tip. "You're late," Ethan said. Slate leaned his shoulder against Ethan's knee. For several seconds, they stayed that way. Ethan remembered the first time he had seen those amber eyes under the table inside Bellwether Hall. Dust. Heat. A blocked exit. Then the strange way Slate had turned back toward the building after being rescued. Ethan had thought the dog was waiting for somebody to come out. He had been right. It had simply taken 11 days and half a town to understand who. Slate stepped away. He looked toward Oliver, then back at Ethan. Ethan scratched once behind the bent ear. "Go on." Slate turned. He trotted back across the lane. Oliver waited beside the marker. The dog returned to his left side without being called. Ethan stood. There was no sadness in seeing Slate choose Oliver. Maybe a little emptiness. But emptiness was not always loss. Sometimes it was simply the space left behind when something had gone where it belonged. Leah came to stand beside him. "You ready?" Ethan looked at Hale Hardware, at Bellwether Hall, at May's old sign, at the temporary market tents beginning to come down one by one, at Mesa Vista's cranes in the distance, fewer than before, but still there. "Yeah." He climbed into the truck. Leah leaned one arm through the open window. "You're coming back for the drill in November. That's the plan. Plans change. So do towns." Leah smiled. "Look at you. One earthquake and suddenly you're philosophical. Driveway's clear?" She slapped the door. "Get out of here." Ethan pulled away. In the mirror, Leah remained outside Hale Hardware until he reached the intersection. Bellwether Hall grew smaller behind him. It was not whole. The missing south wing would never return in its old form. Mesa Vista was no longer the project Richard Sloane had first presented. May Holloway no longer owned the shop she had opened every morning for 38 years. Leah did not know whether Hale Hardware would still be hers 5 years from now. Oliver still had physical therapy appointments. Megan had a new job and an old decision she would probably think about for a long time. Caleb could not undo 11 days of silence. Slate would still sit every time a field reader beeped because a patient engineer had taught him that routine years earlier. Nothing had been restored perfectly. That was not what Ashford Mesa had chosen. The town had chosen something less clean and more honest. To remove what could not safely stay. To repair what could. To allow people to leave without calling them disloyal. To let people remain without treating them as obstacles to progress. To build new things without pretending the old things had no value. And to stop allowing the loudest voice, the deepest pocket, or the greatest fear to decide for everyone else. Ethan drove east until Bellwether Hall disappeared from the mirror. He did not feel that he was abandoning it. That surprised him. For most of his life, staying had seemed like proof of loyalty, and leaving like its opposite. Ashford Mesa had taught him a more difficult version. Sometimes protecting a place meant accepting that it would change. Sometimes protecting another person meant letting them make a choice you would not make. And sometimes loyalty was not about staying beside someone forever. Sometimes it was knowing when to search, knowing when to wait, and when the person you loved had finally found the way home, knowing you could let them go. Sometimes the hardest thing is not knowing what should be saved. It is knowing when to stop deciding for someone else. Ashford Mesa changed because people finally chose to tell the whole truth, even when that truth was inconvenient. Some stayed, some left, some rebuilt, and Slate simply returned to the person he had been waiting for. In our own lives, we may not control what changes around us, but we can choose honesty, courage, and respect for the choices of others. Sometimes grace is not keeping everything the same. Sometimes it is giving people enough truth and freedom to choose their next step. If this story meant something to you, share your thoughts in the comments and tell us what you would have chosen. And if you'd like to hear more stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel. May you have wisdom for the choices ahead and peace with the ones you have already made.